September 1995 was unusually quiet across the Northwest. Summer had already faded, giving way to a cool breeze, scented with damp pine needles and rotting leaves. It was at this time of year that Leo Vanderbilt, a 42-year-old architect from Portland, made a decision that would later be considered reckless. He rented a small boat in the village of Old Harbor and set out alone for an uninhabited island known locally as Owl Rock. The island was a small patch of land, covered in centuries-old spruce trees and dotted with granite boulders, upon which the waves of the vast, cold Lake Crescent had crashed for centuries. Vanderbilt left a brief note on company letterhead on the desk of his architectural firm partner, Jonathan Price. It informed him that Leo was leaving for 3 days to work in solitude on a new project that required absolute concentration. He specified the approximate location, the area around Lake Crescent, and promised to contact him upon his return. Price said this decision didn't seem out of the ordinary. Leo had always been a private person, and after the tragic death of his 12-year-old daughter Sarah in a car accident 2 years earlier, his craving for solitude had only intensified. Colleagues described him in those days as an introverted yet focused professional, finding solace in the strict lines and mathematical precision of his drawings. Vanderbilt's boat was discovered exactly 3 days later. It was found by a fisherman checking his nets. The vessel was carefully moored to the only wooden pier on the western end of the island, its rope securely fastened. Price's concern, having received no call, prompted him to contact the Old Harbor Sheriff's Office. A search party landed on the island the next day. Their findings yielded not answers, but a profound uncertainty. 100 meters from the shore, in a small clearing, a camp had been set up. An Evergreen 2 tent was pitched with meticulous precision, the guy lines evenly taut. Inside, a sleeping bag was neatly folded, and an unopened thermos of cold coffees stood nearby. Canned food, a chocolate bar, and a book on acoustic physics were laid out on a makeshift tree stump table. All belongings, including the backpack, expensive camera equipment, and documents, remained in place. There were no signs of struggle, panic, or sudden flight. It seemed as if the camp had been abandoned in a split second, as if its occupant had simply vanished into the thin autumn air. The key anomaly, defying any logical pattern, was Vanderbilt's wristwatch, a Swiss chronometer, a gift from his late wife. It was found lying on the very tree stump that served as a table. The crystal was intact, but both the hour and minute hands were broken off. Someone had arranged these fragments on the dial with incomprehensible precision. They were arranged in a perfectly straight line, their points pointing away from the camp and into the island's interior, into an impenetrable thicket of spruce trees and boulders covered in a thick layer of moss. A search with dogs, lasting several days, yielded no results. No traces, scraps of clothing, or any other evidence of where the architect might have gone were found. Leo Vanderbilt, the man who came to the island seeking silence, became a permanent part of it, leaving behind only a perfectly organized camp and the silent sign of a broken clock, whose message remains undecipherable. Leo Edward Vanderbilt's missing person case, number 95-4-387, was formally closed and transferred to the Crescent County Sheriff's Office after 14 months of intense but fruitless searching. The official report, signed by Sheriff Matthew Hayes, is a dry, methodical recitation of facts, where every detail is carefully weighed and every assumption countered, ultimately creating a picture of an insurmountable logical impasse. The circumstances of disappearance section details the camp's condition. It notes that food and water supplies were untouched, ruling out a voluntary retreat for extended survival in the forest. Personal belongings, including a wallet with cash, a driver's license, and credit cards, were left behind, making it unlikely that the disappearance was staged to escape and start a new life. Particular emphasis was placed on the absence of any signs of a struggle. No torn clothing, no drag marks, no blood spatter, no damage to the tent or surrounding soil. The report notes that the soil around the camp was soft and retained footprints, but the only clear tracks were those of Vanderbilt's own shoe soles, leading from the boat to the tent and back. A separate subsection was devoted to the possibility of an accident. It was noted that Owl Rock Island, despite its rocky name, had no sheer cliffs in the immediate vicinity of the camp. Divers had searched the shoreline for a body, but the search was unsuccessful. Investigators deemed an attack by a wild animal, such as a bear or cougar, extremely unlikely due to the lack of characteristic claw marks, torn gear, or food remains that would have attracted predators. The condition of the camp, according to experts, was more consistent with a scene abandoned in perfect order than the site of an attack. The document placed particular emphasis on the psychological profile of the missing man. Attached was a statement from Jonathan Price, who described Vanderbilt as a brilliant but deeply withdrawn man, chronically depressed after the death of his daughter. Price told investigators that in his final months, Leo often spoke of the need to hear the silence, which colleagues perceived as a metaphor for creative crisis. However, despite his depressed state, the architect left no direct indication of suicidal intent. No suicide note was found. His financial affairs were in perfect order, and he demonstrated complete professional competence at work. This ruled out a planned suicide, but left open the possibility of an impulsive act of despair, although this still did not explain the absence of a body. The discovery of the wristwatch was described in the report with official meticulousness, devoid of any speculation. The make and model of the chronometer were listed, and the damage to the hands and their peculiar arrangement were noted. The document stated that the watch's mechanism had stopped between 2:10 and 2:15 p.m., but it could not be determined whether this occurred on the day of the disappearance or later. Regarding the hand, constructed from fragments and pointing inland, a cautious suggestion was made that it might have been a message left by Vanderbilt himself. However, subsequent searches in that direction, including combing the area and using thermal imaging from the air, revealed nothing significant. This detail remained in the case as an unexplained anomaly, defying rational interpretation. In the final section of his report, Sheriff Hayes concluded that, despite the thoroughness of the investigation, insufficient evidence had been gathered to support any of the main theories. The lack of a body, physical evidence, and a definitive motive led to the case being suspended. The official statement read, "All possible lines of inquiry have been exhausted. There is no basis for further active investigation." For authorities, Leo Vanderbilt's story had become a file of documents gathering dust on an archive shelf. But for the few familiar with the details, the case had become something more, a perfect, silent mystery, cold and untouchable, like the granite boulders of Owl Rock Island. The silence the architect sought consumed not only himself, but also all attempts to find a logical explanation. Nearly 3 decades passed before Leo Vanderbilt's case regained attention, moving from the archives into the digital realm. In 2024, documentary filmmaker and blogger Alex Reeves, whose channel specialized in analyzing unsolved cases and urban legends in the Northwest, stumbled upon a digitized copy of the Old Harbor Sheriff's report while working on a series about missing persons in national forests. What initially seemed like a routine case, upon closer examination, revealed features of a systemic anomaly that defied both criminal and psychological paradigms. Reeves, a man with an analytical mind and a skepticism honed over years of dealing with the most incredible stories, was struck not so much by the mystical element as by the absolute, meticulous inexplicability of what had happened. The perfect order in the camp, the valuables left behind, the lack of traces, all of this contradicted basic models of human behavior in a crisis. But the main hook that caught his attention was the story of the watch. This material, tactile artifact, bearing the stamp not simply of strangeness, but of some meaningful, albeit irrational action, became Alex's starting point. He began his own investigation, driven not so much by a desire to find an answer. His experience told him that in such cases there are no answers, but by a desire to competently document the very structure of the mystery. The first step was to try to find living witnesses to the events. Jonathan Price, Vanderbilt's partner, died of a heart attack in 2012. Sheriff Matthew Hayes retired, and according to his successor, long ago declined to comment, citing declining health. However, Reeves managed to contact a former deputy involved in the initial search, who agreed to speak on the condition of complete anonymity. Their conversation, recorded over the phone, was somber and evasive. The former officer, whose voice betrayed age and fatigue, confirmed that Vanderbilt's case stood out in his experience. He said that search dogs, usually reliable at tracking, were behaving erratically on the island. They were unable to follow a scent trail, circling in place, showing signs of restlessness and disorientation. He also mentioned that one of the volunteers, an experienced tracker, insisted on the second day of the search that he had heard a sound in the depths of the island, similar to a distant child's cry. But subsequent checks of this area revealed nothing, and the tracker himself subsequently retracted his words, attributing everything to auditory hallucinations caused by fatigue and stress. The most significant interaction was with Sheriff Hayes himself. The retiree, having learned of the documentary filmmaker's interest, conveyed a brief but powerful message through his lawyer. Some doors are best left unopened. Some silences should not be disturbed. This phrase, which took on an ominous connotation in the context of Vanderbilt's own notes, only strengthened Alex's resolve. He took it not as a warning of danger, but as confirmation that the case contained a deep, disturbing element, one that even seasoned police officers had sensed. The next step involved working with the architect's own legacy. Reeves discovered Vanderbilt's dissertation in the Portland University Library, which focused on the influence of acoustic fields on human psychophysiological states in enclosed architectural spaces. Written in a dry, academic style, the text contained unexpectedly poetic and disturbing passages. The young Leo discussed negative sound space, zones where natural resonance is suppressed, creating a sensory deprivation effect. He wrote that in such artificially created silence, the human consciousness, deprived of external reference points, begins to project the contents of the subconscious outward, and the boundary between the inner and outer worlds thins to the point of disappearing. The appendices to the work included drawings of complex geometric structures designed, as the notes explained, to absorb rather than reflect sound waves. These diagrams were strikingly similar to those later discovered in his travel notebook. Having received official permission from county authorities, now more accommodating to enthusiasts than they had been 30 years ago, Alex Reeves began planning an expedition to Owl Rock Island. His goal wasn't to search for evidence that might elude professionals, but to experience the atmosphere of the place, capture it on video and audio, and create a documentary portrait of the mystery itself. He intended to use modern equipment, highly sensitive microphones capable of detecting infrasound and ultrasound, thermal imaging cameras, and panoramic cameras. His approach was methodological. He intended to transform the island into a laboratory for studying the anomaly. Before leaving, Reeves reread all the collected materials. A portrait emerged of a man not simply fleeing grief, but purposefully seeking a threshold, a boundary of perception. Vanderbilt, the architect, designed spaces capable of altering states of consciousness. Vanderbilt, the grieving father, may have sought a way to drown out the unbearable internal noise of pain. Owl Rock Island, with its natural acoustics, might have seemed like an ideal testing ground. The idea that he had found not just silence there, but something inhabiting that silence itself, was transforming from a hypothesis into a working model for Alex. He understood that he was going not to the site of a disappearance, but to the site of an experiment, the consequences of which remained unknown to both its author and those who attempted to investigate. Vanderbilt's legacy lay not in the unbuilt buildings, but in that gaping void, in that question that continued to echo decades later, in the silence itself that drew new researchers. Alex Reeves's expedition to Owl Rock Island began on an overcast morning in late September, almost exactly replicating the timeline of Vanderbilt's disappearance. appearance. The weather seemed deliberately designed to create the perfect backdrop. Low clouds pressed against the surface of Lake Crescent, turning the water a leaden gray, and the air was still and ringingly quiet. The crossing by motorboat took less than an hour, and soon Alex landed alone on the very same rickety pier where rescuers had tied up their boat 3 decades earlier. His first impression wasn't a sense of unease, but an almost physical sense of oppression. The island didn't seem hostile. Rather, it was utterly indifferent, self-absorbed. The giant spruce trees, their trunks thick with moss, stood motionless sentinels, absorbing every sound. Even the sound of the boat's engine, heading for the mainland, was absorbed almost instantly by this acoustic cotton wool, leaving behind an unnatural, oppressive silence. Methodically, following the map compiled from the sheriff's report, Alex made his way to the clearing. The site of Vanderbilt's camp was virtually unchanged. The stump that had served as a table was still there, now almost completely fused with the earth and covered in lichen. Reeves had set up base camp a few meters from the historic site, careful not to disturb it. His actions were measured and unromantic. He pitched a tent, laid out equipment, and started up portable generators. He was not an adventurer, but a technician, come to study the anomaly. The first day was devoted to a total scan of the area. He walked the entire perimeter of the clearing and the adjacent forest, recording continuous video with 3 cameras simultaneously, and audio with a high-sensitivity microphone. A preliminary analysis of the audio track, done on-site on a laptop, revealed a strikingly poor soundscape. Not only were birds and insects absent, but even the familiar sound of the wind in the treetops. The equipment recorded a near-perfect silence, broken only by the documentary filmmaker's own footsteps and the occasional muffled clicks of the equipment. This was the very negative sound zone Vanderbilt wrote about, but created not by him, but by nature itself. On the second day, following the directions of the broken clock, Alex began a slow, methodical journey into the island's interior. He followed the azimuth formed by the hands on the dial, picking his way through thickets of ferns and climbing over boulders covered in slippery moss. The forest grew denser, the light beneath the canopy dimmer. About half a kilometer from camp, he came across a narrow crevice between 2 massive granite boulders. It was almost invisible behind a curtain of hanging moss and cobwebs. Something, perhaps intuition, perhaps a subconscious calculation, made him stop and look inside. Having cleared the entrance, he squeezed through with difficulty. It was dry and cool inside. The flashlight beam revealed a small space, no more than a meter deep from the darkness, and there, at the farthest point, lay an object that clearly did not belong in nature. It was a rusty oval medallion, blackened by time. The leather cord from which it hung had rotted and snapped. Alex, putting on gloves, carefully lifted the find. The medallion was heavier than it looked. With great difficulty, using a knife, he managed to pry open the jammed lid. Inside, beneath a layer of oxide and dust, was a faded, yellowed photograph. It depicted a smiling girl of about 10 years old, with 2 long blonde braids. It was Sarah Vanderbilt. Her image, preserved in this stone tomb, looked back at him 3 decades later with a serene expression, unaware of the tragedy to come. At the moment of discovery, Alex felt nothing but the researcher's cold interest. He carefully photographed the medallion in situ, packed it into a special evidence container, and continued examining the crevice, but found nothing else. Only in the evening, returning to camp and reviewing the footage he'd captured during the day, did he notice something. The footage, captured by a wide-angle camera mounted on his chest at the precise moment he bent down to pick up the medallion, showed more than just him and the granite walls of the crevasse. In the background, in the dark opening, barely discernible among the drooping moss, stood a blurry, indistinct silhouette. It was too tall and thin to be a bear, and its posture, upright, without the animal's characteristic lean, seemed unnatural. The object didn't move. It simply stood there, observing. In his report, Alex would later write that, absorbed in his discovery, he saw and heard absolutely nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no sense of another presence. This video recording became the first piece of physical evidence that defied rational explanation. It didn't prove the existence of ghosts or monsters. It captured an anomaly, a visual noise that, however, had a recognizable anthropomorphic form. And this anomaly was located in close proximity to the only physical evidence connected to Leo Vanderbilt's personal tragedy. For Alex Reeves, a skeptic and documentarian, this was more than just an examination of an old case. It became a direct, if silent, dialogue with the mystery itself. Alex Reeves's return from Owl Rock Island marked a shift from fieldwork to desk work, from sensation to analysis. The locket with Sarah Vanderbilt's photograph and the video recording of an unidentified figure were more than just finds. They were keys that needed to be found to unlock a complex lock. The central piece of this puzzle remained the identity of Leo Vanderbilt himself. Was he a victim of circumstance, a madman, or an explorer who had crossed some forbidden boundary? Fortune, often favored by those who persist, smiled on Reeves. Through a fellow historian conducting archival research at Portland State University, he managed to establish contact with the daughter of the investigator who had led the 1995 disappearance case. The woman, Elizabeth Gray, worked as an archivist at a private foundation dedicated to preserving the region's historic heritage. She remembered the Vanderbilt case, not from the documents, but from the changes it had wrought in her father, who had become silent and withdrawn after its closure. Driven less by an interest in the mystery than by a desire to understand the source of her father's depression, Elizabeth, bypassing formalities, granted Alex access to a box of personal effects that Sheriff Hayes had seized from the architect's studio for inspection and had inadvertently failed to return. Among the blueprints, invoices, and personal correspondence was the travel notebook. Studying the notebook was a revelation for Reeves. While Vanderbilt had discussed acoustics abstractly in his university dissertation, in these field notes his ideas took on a concrete form, transforming into a project that was frightening in its obsession. The notebook was filled with sketches, calculations, and short, abrupt sentences written in a nervous, hurried hand. The pages were filled with complex geometric shapes, spirals, parabolic lattices, structures reminiscent of honeycombs or fractal antennas. Formulas relating to the physics of sound, absorption coefficients, and resonant frequencies were scrawled in the margins. Alex, not being an engineer, consulted with acoustics expert Dr. Michael Shaw of Stanford University, sending him scans of the most revealing pages. The expert's response was brief and unambiguous. Vanderbilt was designing a device he called a resonator of silence in his notes. According to Dr. Shaw, theoretically, such a structure, when constructed from certain materials and at a certain scale, could create a zone of extreme sound absorption, even to the point of complete attenuation at certain frequencies. This would be not just silence, but aggressive silence, a zone where sound energy is not reflected, but absorbed and dissipated. Shaw noted that such anomalies are extremely rare in nature, but not impossible, and that Owl Rock Island, with its unique geology and dense coniferous cover, could possess natural properties that enhance such an effect. But the most disturbing aspect of the notebook wasn't the drawings, but the textual notes. They revealed not method, but motivation. Among the dry calculations, phrases slipped in, reminiscent of the diary entries of someone on edge. The noise inside never ceases. The rustle of her dress in the next room, the click of her heels on the parquet floor, her laughter. It's an echo that never dies, Vanderbilt wrote a few weeks before the trip. And further, if I cannot kill the memory, I must kill the medium in which it resonates. I must find a place where the echo loses its power. Create a space where nothing can resonate. Another entry, apparently made on the island, read, "They haven't gone away. They're just waiting for silence. I must be quiet enough to hear them." These fragments formed a terrifying picture. Leo Vanderbilt had gone to the island not for peace, but with a clear, if mad, purpose. He was seeking, or attempting to create, an acoustic vacuum to drown out the unbearable inner noise of his loss. He was interested not in silence as the absence of sound, but in silence as an active, absorbing force. In his mind, grief, memory, and sound merged into a single whole. He was an architect attempting to engineer his own oblivion. For Alex Reeves, this opened a new, ominous perspective. What if Vanderbilt had succeeded? What if he had managed, either intentionally or accidentally, with his resonator or by discovering a natural anomaly, to activate that very aggressive silence? And if sound is vibration, energy, then what happens to matter when it is deprived of this fundamental property? The recording suggested the architect believed that in absolute silence, other layers of reality become visible or tangible. Those who wait for the silence. Whether these were the figments of his own deranged mind or something more, Alex now had to discover. He understood that he was dealing not simply with one man's tragedy, but with a dangerous experiment, the consequences of which were perhaps still active on the island. And the next phase of this experiment was himself. The desk job, with its dusty archives and digital scans, suddenly ended, giving way to an unsettling, tangible reality. Alex Reeves sat in a darkened listening room, headphones, creating a sense of complete isolation. A spectrogram, a visual representation of the sound recorded on Owl Rock Island, spread out on a monitor before him. It was the very recording made by a high-sensitivity microphone at the moment the medallion was discovered. Initially, upon normal listening, the track seemed completely empty, a dead zone in the soundscape. But Alex, mindful of Vanderbilt's theory of other frequencies, subjected the recording to computer analysis. His initial search focused on the infrasound range, low-frequency vibrations inaudible to the human ear, but capable of evoking feelings of anxiety, unease, and even panic, and he found them. The spectrogram revealed a persistent, powerful infrasound wave, emanating, according to the data, from the depths of the island, precisely in the direction the clock hands pointed. This wave pulsed at a frequency close to 19 Hz, a frequency some studies associate with a sense of otherworldly presence and inexplicable fear. This offered a scientific explanation for the oppressive state he, and likely the rescuers 30 years earlier, had experienced on the island. The nature of this infrasound remained a mystery. A geological anomaly, the operation of some unknown mechanism, or something else entirely. But the real shock awaited him when, almost in despair, he began filtering the recording in the ultrasonic range, and then, using complex algorithms, slowing down and translating these frequencies into the audible spectrum. At first, it was just chaotic noise, whistling and squeaking, reminiscent of static. However, after hours of painstaking work, applying noise-canceling filters and boosting certain frequencies, a voice began to emerge from the cacophony, or rather, something only vaguely resembling one. It was a whisper, distorted beyond recognition, as if filtering through layers of water and stone. It was superimposed on itself, polyphonic, like a one-person choir. Alex spent several more days cleaning the recording, separating these vocal layers. And then, from the digital void, a phrase emerged. It was spoken with a heartbreak, a despair that even the distortion couldn't erase. "I couldn't save her." He immediately compared the spectrographic signature of this voice with available samples of Leo Vanderbilt's voice, a short interview for local television found in a digital archive. The match was almost 100%. It was him. The architect's voice, recorded at the very moment Alex found the locket with his daughter's photograph. But how was that possible? Vanderbilt hadn't physically been in that crevice for 30 years. The microphone wasn't recording ghosts, it was capturing sound vibrations in the air. So those vibrations were somehow present there and then. This discovery turned everything upside down. It wasn't mystical, it was physical. There was some phenomenon on the island capable of recording and storing sound, perhaps in the very rocks with the special resonant properties that Vanderbilt had studied. Or, even more terrifying, his resonator of silence worked, but not as expected. It didn't destroy sound, but somehow captured it, preserved it in the zone of acoustic vacuum it created, and these sound ghosts were released when this zone was disturbed, for example, by the appearance of a living person. Alex, with his presence, his movement, his breathing, like a record player's needle, read the recording left behind by decades ago. The phrase "couldn't save her" was key. It wasn't just a statement of guilt, it was the quintessence of his grief, his obsession, his motivation for this risky experiment.
This recording wasn't a random fragment.
It was the core of the entire tragedy, its emotional peak, inextricably woven into the acoustic fabric of the place. For Alex, this was no longer a documentary project. It had become personal. He heard the voice of a dead man, his dying groan, imprinted on the very fabric of the island. Scientific explanations, resonance, psychoacoustics, didn't make the experience any less eerie.
They merely lent it the weight of irrefutable fact.
The island wasn't haunted in the classic sense. It was a gigantic, anomalous phonograph record, recording the agony of one man, and now that record was beginning to play again. Now he had to return, not as an observer, but as an active participant. He had to find the epicenter, the source of the infrasound, and this sound trap. He understood that he risked not just encountering something inexplicable, but becoming part of this recording, another voice in this polyphonic chorus of despair, forever inscribed in the chilling silence of Owl Rock. Alex Reeves's return to Owl Rock Island this time wasn't an expedition. It was an immersion. He arrived at dawn, and this time the silence greeted him not as a passive state, but as an active, almost hostile force. The air, still and thick, seemed to resist his movement, absorbing every sound before it could even be born. He was no longer an explorer. He was a trigger, a living key inserted into the lock of an anomaly.
His equipment was now different.
In addition to cameras and microphones, he carried a portable infrasound detector, a laser interferometer for measuring the slightest vibrations, and a powerful laptop for real-time data analysis. His goal was not to find new clues, but to actively interact with what he now called the Vanderbilt phenomenon. He intended to find the epicenter. Relying on the infrasound data obtained last time and checking the azimuth indicated by the watch hands, Alex moved deeper into the island along a new, more challenging route. The forest grew denser, the boulders more massive. The infrasound detector began to emit an alarming low hum, recording the increasing intensity of the waves. The pressure in his ears grew, developing into a dull headache. The air seemed heavier. Breathing became more difficult, not from a lack of oxygen, but from the sensation that the atmosphere itself had become dense and viscous. He emerged into a small, almost perfectly circular clearing that hadn't appeared on any maps. In its center stood a solitary, unnaturally straight black basalt monolith, like a giant crystal partially sunken into the earth. The stone's surface was smooth, as if polished, and devoid of moss or lichen. It was here that the instrument readings went off the charts. Infrasound emanated from here, from beneath the earth, pulsing with the rhythm of a giant, dormant heart. That was one discovery. The second was that his microphones aimed at the stone stopped transmitting any signal. Not silence, but a complete, absolute zero. This wasn't just a silent zone. It was a hole in the acoustic field, an active absorber. It was here that Alex Reeves conducted his final experiment. He set up a camera on a tripod, aimed it at the monolith, and turned on recording mode. He walked to the edge of the clearing, to the very edge of the anomaly's zone, and began slowly, step by step, approaching the stone, continuously recording audio on a lavalier microphone and monitoring the interferometer readings. For the first few meters, nothing changed except for growing physical discomfort, and then he crossed an invisible boundary. It was like diving underwater, but without the resistance of the liquid. The sound of his footsteps faded, the rustling of his jacket, his own breathing vanished. And then his consciousness, deprived of external reference points, began to compensate for their absence with projections of his inner world. But these weren't his thoughts. Silently, like credits, alien images began to scroll through his mind. A flash. A girl with braids running across a green field. A flash. A woman's face distorted with terror. A flash. The black trunk of a car. Fragments of alien memory, alien grief, alien horror flashed through his head. He realized he wasn't simply standing in a zone of silence. He was standing inside a gigantic reservoir, where not sounds were stored, but the very psychic imprints of the tragedies absorbed by this place. They weren't entities, but recordings of agony. Vanderbilt was right. They waited for silence, to be heard by someone quiet enough to act as a relay for them. He saw him, Leo Vanderbilt, not a ghost, but a vivid, haunting mental image projected directly into his consciousness. The architect knelt before the monolith, his hands pressed to the cold stone, his mind torn by grief and guilt, mingled with a mad scientific triumph. He had found a way to numb the pain. He had merged with the anomaly, become part of it, paying for oblivion with his own identity, dissolving his self into this collective repository of suffering. Alex, gripped by primal terror, did the last thing he could. He instinctively retreated, thrown out of range like a cork from a bottle. Sound crashed over him like an avalanche, his own hoarse breathing, the snap of a branch underfoot, the distant cry of a seagull. He collapsed to the ground, shaking all over. Later, reviewing the camera footage, he saw that, while outside the zone, it had captured his figure slowly approaching the stone. And at the moment he subjectively perceived the visions, his silhouette in the video became translucent, as if dissolving into thin air. Alex Reeves's report on his second expedition was formally complete. It contained graphs, spectrograms, and dry observations of physical phenomena, but the real conclusion remained beyond it. Leo Vanderbilt did not disappear. He achieved the silence he sought and became its eternal guardian. Owl Rock Island is not a place where people disappear. It is a place where pain is absorbed, where despair takes on the physical form of active non-existence, and it will await the next seeker of silence, the next victim, the next volunteer to join the silent choir, eternally whispering in the void. History is not over. It has simply fallen silent, only to one day be heard again.